1940, the world is on fire. The Nazi war machine, a terrifyingly efficient juggernaut, has steamrolled Poland, devoured Denmark and Norway, and is now sweeping through France with almost casual ease. The British are trapped at Dunkirk, their backs against the sea, and the swastika is flying over Paris. From his opulent headquarters, the man often called the second most powerful in the Third Reich, the head of the seemingly invincible Luftwaffe, Reich's Marshal Hermann Göring, is at the absolute peak of his power. Meanwhile, an ocean away, President Franklin D. Roosevelt watches the storm clouds gathering. He goes before Congress with a plea that sounds not just audacious, but downright fantastical. He asks the nation to get ready to produce an unprecedented 50,000 military aircraft a year. Now, to put that into perspective, in all of 1939, the United States had scraped together just 404. The entire American aviation industry was a boutique operation next to the industrial titans of Germany. Roosevelt's request sounded like a desperate, impossible dream. When news of this absurd proposal reached Göring, he just laughed. Surrounded by his generals, basking in the glow of endless victories, he scoffed at the very idea. What could a distant, decadent commercial republic possibly know about building the tools of war? The Americans, he reportedly jeered with utter contempt, are very good at making refrigerators and razor blades. It could not have been more wrong. That one arrogant boast born from a deep-seated ideological blindness would become a reversed prophecy. That moment of mockery was the quiet click before a landslide. Göring didn't know it, but his words weren't just a dismissal. They were an unintentional challenge, a challenge that America would meet not with speeches, but with a torrent of steel, aluminum, and fire, an industrial tsunami that wouldn't just defy the Third Reich, but utterly bury it. This is the story of how one man's hubris woke a sleeping giant, the story of how a nation of shopkeepers and farmers built the arsenal of democracy, and in doing so sealed the fate of Hermann Göring and his thousand-year Reich. To the man who laughed, Göring and arrogance really get the scale of Hermann Göring's blunder. You have to understand the man and the ideology that blinded him. By 1940, Göring wasn't just a military leader. He was a symbol of the Nazi regime's swaggering success. A decorated fighter ace from World War I, he was the last commander of the legendary flying circus once led by the Red Baron himself. He cultivated this image of a boisterous, larger-than-life figure draped in custom uniforms and dripping with stolen art. In his own mind, he was a Renaissance man living out a grand destiny. His public pronouncements were exercises in pure arrogance. As the war began, he famously promised the German people, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Göring. You may call me Meyer." Since Meyer is a common German name, it was a boast of absolute certainty. A few months later, as his Luftwaffe prepared to hammer Great Britain, he asked, "My Luftwaffe is invincible, and so now we turn to England." How long will this one last? 2, 3 weeks. This was the mindset that heard Roosevelt's call for 50,000 planes and laughed. It wasn't just overconfidence. It was a fundamental underestimation of his enemy, rooted in core Nazi beliefs. The Nazis saw America as a soft, racially mixed, materialistic society obsessed with consumer comforts. To them, a nation that celebrated jazz and Hollywood, a mongrel society without the supposed purity and martial discipline of the Aryan race, could never muster the will for total war. Sure, they were good at making fancy cars and refrigerators, but that was a frivolous skill, not one that could forge the weapons of a superpower. This ideological blindness was so profound that it led Göring and Hitler to ignore their own intelligence. German military attaches in the United States were sending back increasingly alarmed reports about the sheer scale of American industrial potential. They saw the vast factories of Detroit, the endless railways, the immense resources. They warned that if this sleeping giant were ever fully awakened, it can outproduce the entire Axis by itself. But these reports were dismissed. The leadership in Berlin simply couldn't or wouldn't believe them. To them, American boasts were just bluffs from a nation of bluffers. Even in his post-war, the greatest miscalculation of a lifetime interrogations, Göring admitted this catastrophic miscalculation. Ha! He told an American psychiatrist he truly believed Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury. That famous remark about refrigerators wasn't just a flippant line. It was a deeply held conviction. It was the greatest miscalculation of my life, he confessed, adding a chillingly poetic final thought. They buried us under an avalanche of production. But in 1940, that avalanche was still just a rumble in a distant mountain. The world saw an America with fewer than 3,000 military aircraft, an army smaller than Portugal's, and a public deeply divided about getting into another European war. Göring saw a weakness. He failed to see the one thing that would make all the difference, the colossal untapped power of American industry, and the one man Roosevelt would choose to, the call to Big Bill, Knudsen, unleash it. While Göring was basking in the glory of his European conquests, a very different kind of man was sitting in a Detroit living room about to change the course of history. His name was William S. Knudsen, and he was the polar opposite of the flamboyant Reich Marshal. Where Göring was aristocratic and bombastic, Knudsen was a humble Danish immigrant, a quiet giant of industry. Born in Copenhagen in 1879, Signos Wilhelm Paul Knudsen came to America in 1900 at age 20 with little more than a dream and a knack for mechanics. He took odd jobs in shipyards and railroad shops, teaching himself English by listening to kids in the neighborhood. His was the classic American immigrant story. He landed a job at a bicycle factory that soon started making parts for a new automaker, the Ford Motor Company. Knudsen was a natural. He had an intuitive genius for production, foreseeing not just how to make one of something, but how to make thousands, then tens of thousands, efficiently and perfectly. He shot up the ranks at Ford, becoming a key architect of the mass production system that made the Model T a global icon. After a falling out with the notoriously difficult Henry Ford, Knudsen was poached by rival General Motors in 1922. There, his star rose even higher. As president of Chevrolet, he turned it into a powerhouse that eventually outsold Ford. By 1937, the Danish immigrant who had arrived with nothing was the president of General Motors, the largest industrial corporation on earth. In May 1940, the same month, Göring was mocking America's industrial might. Knudsen got a call from the White House. President Roosevelt needed a man who could turn his fantastical goal of 50,000 planes a year into a reality. He needed a production genius. He needed Big Bill Knudsen. Knudsen gathered his family and told them he was leaving his high-paying job at GM for Washington. When one of his children asked why, his answer was simple: "This country has been good to me and I want to pay it back." He agreed to work for the government for a salary of $1 a year, becoming the most famous of the dollar-a-year men, corporate executives who lent their expertise to the war effort for a nominal fee. Après, Roosevelt put him in charge of the Office of Production Management. Later, in an unprecedented move, Knudsen would be commissioned as a lieutenant general in the U.S. Army, the only civilian in American history to enter the service at such a high rank, a sign of just how critical his mission was. His task was monumental. He had to convince a deeply competitive and individualistic collection of American companies to set aside their rivalries, abandon profitable civilian products, and convert their factories to build the complex machinery of war. He was asking blacksmiths to make watches overnight. He had to orchestrate the greatest industrial pivot in world history, and he had to do it faster than anyone thought possible. Göring had laughed in a nation of refrigerator makers. He was about to find out what happens when a refrigerator maker guided by a genius like Bill Knudsen decides to build a bomber. The challenge facing Knudsen, from cars to bombers, the industrial pivot was staggering. Building a car and building a bomber are worlds apart. A 1940s automobile had about 15,000 parts. A B-24 Liberator heavy bomber had an incredible number of parts. Estimated at nearly 500,000, car bodies were stamped from steel. Aircraft were meticulously assembled from lightweight aluminum. An engine failure in a car leaves you on the side of the road. An engine failure in a bomber over enemy territory was a death sentence. Many in the established aviation industry were skeptical. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, famously quipped, "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight." What they failed to grasp was that Knudsen wasn't just a blacksmith. He was the man who had invented the modern blacksmith shop. He immediately began applying the ruthless logic of auto mass production to the cottage industry of aircraft manufacturing. He and a team of fellow executives, the automobile men, toured aircraft plants and were horrified by what they saw. Planes were being built one at a time by hand like custom suits. It was slow, inefficient, and impossible to scale. Knudsen's gospel was simple: break it down. Any complex process could be broken into a series of smaller, repeatable steps. He envisioned a system where huge components like wings and fuselages would be built as standardized sub-assemblies in factories all across the country. These finished modules would then ship to massive new plants for final assembly. It was the automotive assembly line, but on a scale the world had never seen. The transformation was electric. General Motors alone converted over 100 plants. Cadillac started building M5 Stuart tanks. Pontiac made anti-aircraft cannons. Hewitt built the Pratt & Whitney engines that would power the very bombers Göring thought were a fantasy. Almost overnight, the entire industrial landscape of America shifted. Civilian car production was banned and the full might of American manufacturing turned to war. The numbers tell a story of unbelievable speed. In 1939, the U.S. built just over 2,100 military planes. In 1940, that number more than doubled to over 6,000. By 1941, the year of Pearl Harbor, it shot to over 19. In 1942, as the conversion really hit its stride, America produced a staggering 47 836 aircraft, nearly hitting Roosevelt's impossible goal in just 2 years. And it didn't stop. In 1943, the number soared to 85,898. And in the peak year of 1944, American factories churned out an incredible 96,308 airplanes. All told, the United States produced more aircraft during the war than Germany and Japan combined. The Avalanche, Göring had unknowingly predicted was now thundering down the mountain. Of all the symbols of this, the Will It Run Challenge industrial miracle, none was more powerful or more audacious than a single factory built on a creek bed in rural Michigan. It was called Willow Run. When Henry Ford's production chief Charles Sorensen came back from inspecting Consolidated Aircraft's B-24 plant in San Diego, he was so electrified by the challenge he couldn't sleep. In one night, he sketched out a plan for a new kind of factory, one that would build bombers not by the day, but by the hour. The result was the Willow Run bomber plant. Designed by the famed architect Albert Kahn, it was the largest factory under a single roof in the world. The main building was over half a mile long, and its assembly line made a famous 90 degrees turn just to fit on the property. But the start was rough. The B-24 Liberator was a notoriously complex beast with an estimated 400,000 rivets alone. Ford's engineers, used to the simplicity of cars, struggled. Early production was a nightmare of bottlenecks and delays. The factory was so plagued with issues that people gave it a cynical nickname. Will It Run? This is where the genius of men like Knudsen and Sorensen truly shone. They tackled the problems with relentless innovation. When riveting by hand was too slow, they developed hydraulic riveting machines. They broke down complex assemblies into smaller, more manageable sub-assemblies. And they had to deal with a constant stream of design changes from the front lines, all while keeping the main line moving. A feat of flexibility Germany's rigid system could never match. Slowly but surely, they worked out the bugs. A trickle of planes became a stream and then a flood. By early 1944, the Will It Run joke was dead. At its absolute peak, the Willow Run factory was rolling a finished B-24 Liberator off its mile-long assembly line every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Think about that. One factory in 1 month was producing more heavy bombers than many nations could build in a year. At one point, the Army Air Force had to tell Ford to slow down. They were running out of places to park the finished planes. Bah! Göring had laughed at a country that made refrigerators. Ford had turned a patch of Michigan farmland into a machine that spit out a 4-engine heavy bomber every single hour. The story of Willow Run is an incredible testament to what a determined nation can achieve, and it's a key part of the World War II story that often gets overlooked. If you find these stories of industrial history as fascinating as we do, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. The true secret weapon, a diverse workforce. Machines and factories were only half the equation. The other half, the true secret weapon of the arsenal of democracy, was its people. While the Nazi regime relied on the brutal and inefficient system of slave labor, America mobilized a willing, diverse, and democratic army of civilians. At its peak, the U.S. aircraft industry alone employed 2 million people. With millions of men joining the armed forces, a massive labor vacuum was filled by groups who had never been a major part of the industrial workforce before. The most iconic of these new workers was Rosie the Riveter. Across the country, some 6 million women joined the war industries. By 1943, women made up a massive portion of the aircraft industry's labor force. The symbol was even personified by a real woman, Rose Willow Monroe, who worked as a riveter on B-tours at Willow Run. She and millions like her proved they were more than capable of handling the demanding work of building war machines. But the Rosies were just part of the story. The demand for labor broke down barriers all across society. African-Americans, Mexican-Americans, the disabled, and even the elderly flocked to the factories. For the first time, in places like the Richmond shipyards, integrated crews of men and women of all races worked side by side. While the National War Labor Board promoted the ideal of equal pay for equal work, and it was a radical step, in practice, wage disparities often persisted. Still, the factory floor became an unwitting pioneer for social change. This stood in stark contrast to the Nazi system. Germany's use of forced labor was not only a moral abomination, but also an industrial liability. Enslaved workers had every reason to sabotage the products they were forced to build, leading to weapons plagued with reliability problems. The American system, on the other hand, thrived on cooperation. Workers on the factory floor suggested improvements that increased efficiency. It proved in the most dramatic way possible that a free and motivated workforce could outproduce, out-innovate, and outfight the most brutal totalitarian regime on earth. Herman. The Avalanche of Production. Göring. The laughter was long gone. The mockery had curdled into a sickening dread. The Avalanche of Production he had dismissed was now a daily reality, roaring over the skies of his homeland. Yeah! His boast that no enemy bomber would ever reach the roar had become a bitter joke. German citizens huddled in air raid shelters sarcastically called the Wailing Sirens, Meyer's Trumpets, a permanent reminder of his broken promise. The industrial tsunami unleashed by men like William Knudsen had crashed onto Fortress Europe. By 1944, the air war wasn't a contest anymore. It was an execution. The sheer numbers were overwhelming. When the Luftwaffe lost a plane, it was a grievous blow. When an American bomber went down, it was a tragedy for the crew. But for the Army Air Forces, it was a logistical footnote. The B-24 lost over Germany in the morning was replaced by another one rolling off the Willow Run line that afternoon. The Allies could sustain losses that would have wiped out the Luftwaffe in weeks and still grow stronger. This enabled the round-the-clock bombing campaign that systematically dismantled Germany's ability to wage war. By day, the American 8th Air Force flew massive 1,000-plane raids with B-17 and B-24s escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. By night, the British Royal Air Force continued the assault. They targeted oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, and the very factories where Germany was trying to build its own planes. Göring's Luftwaffe, bled white and unable to replace its losses, could do little to stop it. The final crushing proof of this industrial superiority came on June 6, 1944. On D-Day, as the largest invasion fleet in history assembled, 11,000 Allied aircraft controlled the skies completely unchallenged. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had dominated Europe 4 years earlier, could barely muster 100 flights to oppose the invasion. The game was over. The war ended and Hermann Göring, stripped of his medals and his power, found himself in a prison cell at Nuremberg. During the final reckoning, the trial, he was confronted with the legacy of his arrogance. The American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, presented him with the evidence of America's production miracle, the endless lists of ships, tanks, and of course, airplanes. Confronted with his own office's reports detailing the superiority of American aircraft, Göring's bluster finally failed him. The truth was undeniable. In a lost prison interview from 1945, he finally confessed the strategic blindness that had doomed his regime. He admitted he believed his own propaganda about American softness and that he, more than many others, had a glimmer of understanding of America's latent power. It was, he admitted, a power that could be resorted to. But by the time he truly understood it, it was far too late. Göring was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. He would cheat the hangman by taking his own life just hours before his execution. But his fate had been sealed years earlier, not in a courtroom, but in the moment he chose to laugh at a sleeping giant. This story is a lesson in humility and ingenuity, more than just an anecdote. It's a powerful lesson in the folly of hubris. The victory was won by the courage of soldiers and airmen on the front lines, but it was made possible by the quiet genius of men like William Knudsen and the unheralded work of millions of ordinary citizens on the home front. They were the ones who answered the call, who turned their car factories into bomber plants, and who proved that the true strength of a nation lies not in its boasts, but in its ability to build.